should we have an ecumenical council about homosexuality? I'm Brad Belschner, here today with Dr. Alastair Roberts. We're talking about moral orthodoxy, and today specifically, I want to ask Alastair the question, should we have an ecumenical council about homosexuality? It seems like it might be helpful. It's a big controversy today. We could have an ecumenical council about it, and that might help. What do you think?
No, I don't think we should have one.
Why?
More particularly because I think there's a danger of trying to avoid the very specific task of judgment that we have in the present time by punting the issue into the long grass of a utopian ecclesiology.
What do you mean by that?
That the expectation of an ecumenical council that will solve this problem is in large part an avoidance of the specific task of judgment that faces us right now. There is not going to be an ecumenical council on this issue.
Are you saying that because you think it wouldn't have a vote that'd turn out in favor of Orthodox traditional ethics here, or do you think other reasons?
I think it's more the fact that that expectation that there would be any sort of ecumenical council that would be satisfactory or that would be satisfying for people on either side, that's not going to happen.
But what about like the Nicene Creed, settling Arianism?
It can be helpful actually to think back on those past ecumenical councils where so many of them were hotly disputed and debated, and the work of those councils didn't really occur at the time so much as in retrospect they were appreciated to be truly ecumenical. And what we are often trying to do is to achieve something that is not going to happen within our current church context within the world. It's a utopian vision, but often what it's doing is distracting us from the very specific task of judgment that we face right now. So when Paul talks about the issue of sexual immorality in the church in Corinth, he does not speak about it as something, okay, you're just going to have to sort this issue out. There may be differences on these issues. Let's throw it to the church in Jerusalem and settle it. No, he says you need to deal with this now.
Right.
If you're Orthodox, deal with this now. There's also that danger of issues on which God has made himself very clear. Should we really go to an ecumenical council for those? Now, I think one of the difficulties...
It's not like asking, does Jesus have one nature or two natures? Or what does it mean to be three persons? It's not that, not that complicated, really, is it?
And so the question is, are we prepared to have a judgment? And who has the right of interpretation? This is another thing. The assumption that since these issues are contested, that they are fundamentally contestable and undecided. Now, I believe that Scripture gives us very clear teaching on this, and so has the Church over almost the entirety of its history down to the present. That we have a small blink of history in which this has been seen to be an issue that's been debated does not mean that it's any less certain within Scripture itself.
Right, it's kind of, well, if they have Moses and the prophets and they've not listened to them, then why would an ecumenical council help?
And can you imagine anyone accepting the judgment of an ecumenical council if it went against them? And
even the Nicene Creed itself had folks questioning it after the fact. Shortly after the fact, you have council saying, nope, not that council. And the same would definitely happen today. So how do we deal with people in our lives or churches that we come across that are clearly denying the teachings of Scripture on this subject? What categories do we think about them? How do we live with them and treat them?
It can be helpful to distinguish between judgment upon people and judgment upon issues. That orthodoxy, when we're trying to apply orthodoxy within our situations, is not just a matter of telling everyone who believes the wrong thing that they're a heretic. Rather, there can be people who are submissive to the teaching of the church, but who hold mistaken views. For instance, there are many people who, in the average pew of a Christian church, hold very confused concepts of the Trinity.
Right, yeah.
But yet they're submitted to the church. They are not rejecting its teachings, and they want to understand better. Likewise, on these sorts of issues, I think there will be many people within our churches who truly do not understand why same-sex marriage is an issue. But yet, if they're submitted to the teaching of the church, they're not overturning its principles, they're not opposing its truth.
What do you mean when you say submitting to the teaching of the church? You mean they happen to be in a church that says it's okay, or what do you mean by that?
If they're in a church that's teaching the traditional teaching, the historic ecumenical teaching, that is wrong,
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
but they are not opposing that.
Okay, so they could be personally mistaken and believe the wrong thing about homosexual behavior, but they're in a faithful church, so that affects the way we think about them. And that's
even
different
beyond,
than if they were teaching or something
yes,
like that.
and even beyond that, we have the fact that people show their colours over time. The parable of the wheat and the tares is helpful here, that we don't make peremptory judgments on people without having very clear reason to do so. So it's a case of them directly opposing the teaching of the church, not just holding a mistaken position. Likewise, when it comes to issues, we have clear lines that we draw, and within those lines, we deal with prudence with people.
Right. So a person who holds mistaken beliefs here, but is faithful, we can treat them graciously. I can understand that. And a person who holds these mistaken beliefs and is teaching them, okay, the stakes are higher there. What about a church body or a congregation or even a denomination that is approving of this evil? How do we think about those categories?
We can recognize that God can be at work in even some of these seriously mistaken situations. But we recognize also that these parts of the church are hard hat areas that we do not venture into without significant care. We know that the health of the church is deeply compromised as a result of these false teachings.
Right.
So it could be akin to the example of churches at the time of the Civil War that would split over the issue of slavery. And a split had to take place because this is an issue of such moral consequence that you can't just let it slide.
So we don't need an ecumenical council about homosexuality, partly because it's so clear, partly because it wouldn't settle anything, and partly because we just need to deal with it, which sometimes means we deal with it graciously and sometimes pretty strictly. Thanks, that's helpful.